What if I told you that our national anthem wasn't born in triumph, but out of peril? That when Francis Scott Key wrote "The Flag Was Still There," he wasn't just being poetic. He was bearing witness to a night when the American Republic had come inches from collapse. In this special Memorial Day edition, I want to tell you a story of fire, of consequence, of faith. A battle you think you know, but probably don't. Stick around. The signal begins now. Welcome to the Restless Signal, where we seek truth, wrestle with meaning, and strive to live well. I'm the voice of the signal, and together we're tuning in. Today's episode is different. It's a special Memorial Day transmission, so no bulletin and none of our other regular segments. Just one story, one moment, one signal. This episode came to me unexpectedly. I recently took my boys to visit Fort McHenry in Baltimore, Maryland. I thought I knew the story. It's memorialized in our national anthem, after all. But standing there, I realized I didn't. Not really. And the more I learned, the more I understood this wasn't just a battle. It was a moment of national peril, a miracle of perseverance, a call to memory. And it changed how I see the anthem and what it asks for us. We all know the Star-Spangled Banner. We've sung it at games, heard it echo across stadiums. So the anthem is sacred to us, but also strangely distant. We know the lyrics, but we rarely understand the full story. We forget that the bombs bursting in air weren't metaphors. They were actual weapons. That the red glare of rockets wasn't poetry. It was war. And that the flag still flying in the morning meant we had survived something we were never supposed to. It's a battle we remember through song, but not through understanding. We don't grasp the stakes. We don't realize how close we came to disaster, or what might have happened if it had gone the other way. This wasn't a footnote in history. It was a fork in the road. And more than that, it means something still. Not just because we honor those who stood, but because it shows us what it means to be citizens and what we're supposed to do with the freedom we've inherited. This isn't just a reflection, it's a reckoning, and maybe a renewal. So let's go back to 1814. The United States was barely 3 decades old, and we were at war with the greatest empire on earth, Great Britain. Great Britain was at the height of its power. 250,000 troops across the world, the most powerful navy ever put to sail, with more than 1,000 warships, including numerous ships of the line, the most powerful class of warships of the day, manned by a talented, experienced, and professional officer corps. What's more, they had just defeated Napoleon. Confident in their victory, they could now turn their full attention to the United States. Their navy controlled the seas. Their army was tested, disciplined, and massive. The comparison to what the United States could field at the time is almost comical. Our Navy had just 17 ships and no ships of the line. Our strongest vessels were a handful of overbuilt frigates. Sure, they punched above their weight and could hold their own in duels, but no one was mistaking them for ships of the line. On land, the situation was similarly stark. A small, regular army, barely 15,000 strong, led by a small and inexperienced officer corps. The rest? Militia, volunteers, citizens in uniform with barely any training or standardized equipment. Given the power disparity, it's not hard to imagine that the war was not going well. In August, British troops had marched into Washington and scattered our army. The White House burned. The Capitol charred. The president and cabinet fled into the countryside. The government scattered. Riders had to be sent out across the states simply to let the country know that the republic still existed. The closest comparison in our national memory is to 9/11. And yes, that day was horrifying. I remember it well. It's seared into my memory. The images of the burning towers, the shock, the grief, the sense that something had ruptured. But even in that moment, there was no question that the United States would survive. We were wounded, but still overwhelmingly powerful. No one doubted the existence of the government. No one thought we were on the verge of collapse. But in 1814, it was different. This wasn't an attack from a fringe group. This was the most powerful empire in the world, landing troops on our soil with near total control of our coast. Our capital was in ruins. Our army was small and scattered. Our navy was outmatched 100 to 1. and there were real fears, real conversations about whether the Republic could even hold together. And now, the British were coming for Baltimore. It was the third largest city in the United States, a hub of shipping, industry, and commerce, and to the British, a symbol of American defiance, a nest of privateers that had harassed their navy and cost them dearly. Baltimore was symbolic, it was strategic, and it was vulnerable. So, in the aftermath of Washington, with the embers of the capital still smoldering, the question was this: could Baltimore hold? There are many names from that battle we'll never know or won't remember, but two stand out. Major George Armistead, just 34 years old, was the commander of Fort McHenry, a brick star fort at the mouth of Baltimore Harbor. He had commissioned the massive flag to fly over the fort, one so large that the British could see it from afar. He was ready to make a stand. Another, Francis Scott Key, a lawyer, a civilian. In fact, he had sailed into the British fleet to negotiate the release of a captured friend. The British had agreed, but it held him during the coming battle, so it was not wanting him to leak their war plans. So Key sat aboard a ship in the harbor, watching, waiting. He couldn't fight, he could only watch, and he would become our witness. On September 12th, 1814, 5,000 British troops landed southeast of Baltimore and marched towards the east of the city. They clashed with American militia assembled at North Point. The Americans fought fiercely, and they stalled the British advance. In that fight, General Robert Ross, the British commander, was killed. But eventually, the militia had to withdraw to Baltimore's eastern defenses, which had been dug hastily by thousands of civilians and were guarded by 10,000 troops, mostly untested militia. Given the number disparity, the British knew that they needed their Navy's support. So 19 British warships gathered on the river. Their goal? Take out Fort McHenry. If they could silence the fort's guns, the Navy could sail into the harbor and attack the city from the rear and destroy their defenses. At dawn, on September 13th, the bombardment began. British mortars, rockets, 25 hours of continuous assault. Over 1,500 shells and rockets rained down. The fort was struck repeatedly. Fire blazed from the ramparts. Thunder cracked across the bay. But the fort fired back. Whenever the ships came within range, Armistead's guns opened up. British ships were forced to stay back, keeping their fire largely ineffective. That night, under cover of darkness, the British attempted a landing by small boats to attack from behind, but the Americans were waiting. They opened fire from the fort and from supporting gun batteries elsewhere on the harbor. Fierce resistance forced the boats to withdraw. Rain poured, wind howled, the bombardment dragged on. Inside the fort, the defenders, many young and frightened, held steady. Some were killed, many were wounded, but they endured. They stood, and the shells kept falling. One British soldier watching the scene would later write that the men in Fort McHenry looked like, quote, pigeons tied by the legs to be shot at. That's what it was, a slow, exposed ordeal. No chance to maneuver, no chance to flee, just grit, just faith, just the will to hold the line while the sky cracked open. And all the while, the people of Baltimore watched. They had built the defenses, hauled the dirt, carried the supplies, but now they could only watch. They climbed rooftops, gazed out over the harbor, stared into the rain and smoke, heard the pounding of cannon echo across the water. They weren't soldiers. They were civilians, but they knew what was at stake. And they weren't far away. This wasn't a distant front. This was their home, their city, their families. They stood shoulder to shoulder, soaked and silent, eyes fixed on the darkness, wondering, would the fort hold? Would the city fall? It strikes me how much this resembles something we all know, watching a great contest unfold, like the final minutes of a championship game. You're standing, you're breathless, everything hangs in the balance. But this wasn't a game. This wasn't about a trophy. This is about your life, your home, your country. And they weren't cheering, they were praying. Inside that fort, there were young men they knew, neighbors, sons, clerks and farm boys and volunteers who now stood between the might of a global empire and everything they loved. They couldn't help them. They could only hope. Each explosion brought a terrible mix of emotions. Relief, they're still fighting, the fort still stands. And dread, was that the one that took their son, their friend? Was that the one that struck the powder magazine and would light the whole place sky high? And so they watched, hour after hour, bomb after bomb, waiting, hoping, bracing for the sound that they wouldn't be able to bear. They watched as a free people always has, when the outcome is beyond their control, but not beyond their care. So they watched throughout the night, and they prayed. On the harbor, Francis Scott Key didn't sleep. He stared through his spyglass into the darkness, the smoke, the chaos. And then, just after dawn, the guns stopped. The smoke hung heavy over the water. Key lifted his glass again. His hands trembled. And then he saw it. The flag. Still there, still flying. He was overcome. He pulled out a letter and began to write, "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light." Those words poured out of him. A poem, yes, but more than that, a testimony and a prayer. Within days, the poem was set to the melody of a popular tune at the time, and the song spread like wildfire across the young republic. Not by internet, telephones, or even telegraph, but by horseback and word of mouth. Within a month, it had been published throughout the country. This was what going viral in 1814 looked like, and it's clear that the country longed for and needed some good news. But even more than that, I believe that people realized that something truly significant had happened, and something that we have lost to time. This wasn't just an inspiring battle, Daniel prevailing against Goliath. This was a strategically decisive event, an inflection point in history. Remember, the British had already burned our capital. They held full control of the Chesapeake. If Baltimore had fallen, it wouldn't have just been another dot on the map. It was the third largest city in the country, a commercial engine, a hub of privateering that had cost the British, and the last major American port on the bay. If Fort McHenry had fallen and the city had collapsed, the consequences would have been enormous. The British would have controlled the entire mid-Atlantic coast. The morale of the American people, already shaken, might have shattered. The peace talks underway in Ghent would have taken on a very different tone. And New England, angry about the war and having voted against it, was already discussing secession. A loss here might have pushed them over the edge. The country could have collapsed right then and there. So at the very least, the peace treaty would have imposed punishing terms. We would have lost territory, lost sovereignty, seen our growth stunted, our ambitions hemmed in, and our diplomatic standing in Europe would have become a running joke for a generation. Meaning, no Monroe Doctrine, no Manifest Destiny, no war with Mexico gaining a third of the country. We might have lost the fragile unity that still held the Republic together. The war could have ended not in stalemate, but in humiliation. And everything that came afterwards, our assertion of strength in the Western Hemisphere, our rise as a global power, all of it might have been delayed, diminished, or erased. Some people shrug and say, well, who knows? History is like ripples in a pond. Change one thing and you can't know what follows. That's where I want to pause and push back. I don't believe in the butterfly effect, not as a serious way to engage with real history. It's clever as a mental exercise, but as a worldview, it becomes a kind of nihilism, as if nothing really matters because everything matters equally. Well, real history doesn't work that way. Most small events get absorbed back into the flow of the system. Not every minor decision changes the course of a civilization. No. There are true inflection points, moments where history forks and two futures pull apart. Gettysburg was one. If Lee had succeeded, if he had destroyed the Army of the Potomac and marched on Washington, the Confederacy might have won. The nation split. Our rise halted. Slavery continues, maybe for another generation, maybe longer. Pearl Harbor was one. It brought America into World War II, shifted the balance of power, and helped turn the tide from the Axis to the Allies. Fascism defeated, and out of the rubble rose two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, locked in a Cold War that defined the rest of the century. 9/11 was one. In a single morning, the world changed. We entered the global war on terror, invaded two countries, poured our treasure and focus into the Middle East, maybe at the cost of seeing, too late, the rise of China. And Fort McHenry was one. These are the moments where the system doesn't just absorb, it breaks, and something new is either born or lost. If we had lost at Baltimore, if that flag hadn't still been flying there in the morning, we'd be telling a very different story today. And maybe we wouldn't be telling it at all. So what does this mean for us? And what should we take from this story? Not just as observers of history, but as those living in its aftermath. It means we are not passive beneficiaries of freedom. We are stewards of it, and like every generation before us, we are now called to rise and meet our moment. Let me offer three things the story asks of us, three calls we must answer if we want to honor what was preserved at Baltimore and handed down faithfully. First, we are called to a life of service. Freedom is not just a right, it's a responsibility. A republic is not kept alive by accident, it's kept alive by effort. We don't just enjoy what others fought for, we carry it forward. That's how we honor their sacrifice, and that's how we justify our inheritance, by contributing to the country they preserved. Citizenship is not consumption, it's participation, and we are called to participate boldly, humbly, faithfully. Second, every contribution matters, and everyone is needed. Major Armistead and his soldiers defended the walls. The people of Baltimore dug trenches and hauled supplies. Doctors treated the wounded. Francis Scott Key, a lawyer with no weapon but his pen, gave the moment a voice and gave a nation a new song. None of them won the battle alone, but together they did something that changed history. It's the same today. A nation as vast and complex as ours needs many hands, different talents, different callings, different people stepping forward in different ways. You don't have to be famous. You don't have to be powerful. You just have to show up with what you've been given and use it for something good. Everyone has a post to man. What matters is that you take up yours. And third, we are called to a life of prayer. In the darkness, with cannon booming across the harbor, the people of Baltimore prayed, not because they had no power, but because they knew where power comes from. They stood on rooftops, watching the battle from a distance, and they prayed that the flag would still be there in the morning. And when it was, Francis Scott Key didn't just write a poem. He gave thanks. He knew what he had witnessed was not ordinary. It was deliverance. And so must we. We should pray for strength, for clarity, for wisdom to live well and serve faithfully. We should pray for our country, not because it's perfect, but because it's ours. We should pray in thanksgiving for those who stood when we couldn't, and for the courage to stand when we must. Because we are not strong enough on our own. We never were. Prayer is not weakness. It is strength rightly ordered. It's how free people acknowledge what they depend on most. So on this Memorial Day, let's do more than remember. Let's celebrate. Not just the heroes of the Battle of Baltimore, but all those throughout our history who gave what Lincoln called the full measure of devotion. Let's speak their names. Let's feel their courage. And let's carry what they won forward. Not as something abstract, but as something real, tangible, costly, ours. Because America is not just an idea. It's a nation, a people, a place handed down through sacrifice, defended in the dark and preserved, when it counts, by ordinary citizens who stood their post. And that's what we're called to do, not as subjects of a ruler, but as sovereign citizens, free and equal men and women who take up the call voluntarily to protect their country, their people, their inheritance through the ages, so that the last, best hope of the earth will long endure. Not all of us will fight. Not all of us will lead. But each of us, every one of us, can do something in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our work, with whatever skills, talents, or voice we've been given. That's how a country endures. That's how a people holds together. And that's how a signal spreads, quietly at first, then stronger, from person to person, from family to family, from one generation to the next. This show, The Restless Signal, is my contribution. A small one, but it's mine. A small voice trying to hold the line, tell the truth, and figure out what we should do in this broken world to live well. And I ask you, what's yours? Because the flag was still there on the morning of September 14th, 1814, as a signal to our people and to our enemies that we are still here, proud, strong, resilient, free. And it's still here today. But now it's our time. Let's not be the generation that lets the signal fade. Let's shoulder our burden and carry it forward, clearly, faithfully, and well. That's it for today's show. Thanks for tuning in to this special holiday edition. We'll try to be transmitting again soon. Until then, seek truth, wrestle with meaning, live well, and above all, keep the signal clear. You've been listening to the Restless Signal podcast, copyright 2025, all rights reserved. Check us out on the web at therestlesssignal.com.